Afternoon, everyone. First, I'd like to wish everyone a safe and prosperous Durance Day. Second off, in coming back to the First World War, you'll notice I have not really said much about where former President Theodore Roosevelt was in all of this, who was very much a strong vocal advocate of the war. Now, after his failure to retake the White House in 1912, Roosevelt was still very vocal about what was going on and was openly critical of President Wilson. And in 1914, he was very vocal as well about wanting the United States to mobilize for war. And historians and scholars, some actually agree that had Roosevelt been president in 1914 and not Woodrow Wilson, that there's a great chance, unless Congress really pulled off a miracle, that Roosevelt was going to mobilize the United States and have us fully engaged in the First World War 3 years earlier than we actually were. So that's one thing that would have happened with that. Second off, he was openly critical of Wilson all across the board. Like after the Lusitania sinking in 1915, and Wilson choosing not to take the bait and join the war as the British and French hoped that he would, he referred to President Wilson as that lily-livered skunk in the White House. He did not think very highly of Wilson. He basically thought he was a big coward, and he pushed really hard to undermine the president in that regard. And when the United States did join the war, well, actually before that, things cooled down a little bit. He went to the White House, called upon him, and charmed him the way only Theodore Roosevelt could. And Roosevelt and Wilson kind of cooled things down a little bit, but there was a reason for that. When the United States entered the war in 1917, Colonel Roosevelt, as he liked to call himself, no longer as Mr. President, he really wanted to do what he did during the Spanish-American War, and that's raise a regiment, or a division this time, of volunteers to go over to Europe and fight the Germans. And he was really pushing for that, so he kind of changed his tone toward Wilson a little bit, trying to, how should we say, butter him up and charming him into letting him do that. But he walked out of the White House without the results that he wanted, because many in Congress watched and they looked at, because they were debating whether or not Roosevelt's idea was a good one. Because first off, they were really dreading the idea of doing conscription, doing the draft, because many people remember barely 50 some years earlier how it went over in the Union during the Civil War when they started doing the draft, the New York City draft riots and things of that nature, and they were trying really hard to avoid that. Whereas with Roosevelt's idea, if he got a volunteer army, because a lot of people, like upwards of 2,000 people a day, were writing Theodore Roosevelt saying yes, they would love to be in his new Rough Riders, as he would call them, his new volunteer army, as he called it. But that would be a good alternative to conscription. But at the same time, they remembered quite well how things were during the Spanish-American War. They had a devil of a time getting Roosevelt to follow orders. He was openly critical of his commanders. And they envisioned this, okay, he goes over to Europe, hypothetically, and he's openly critical of his commanders, where things were already very tense with the British and the French as it was. And he just does whatever he wants. He doesn't listen. He kind of just follows what he ever wants to do. He wanted to go over there pretty much as soon as the war started, charging straight into the German lines with a volunteer regiment. And many in the U.S. government were like, how would that make us look if we sent a bunch of green troops over there under Theodore Roosevelt and have it all just go to pieces immediately? How would that make us look to our allies? So they pretty much went against that. And actually what happened was, shortly after the United States declared war in April of 1917, Woodrow Wilson signed the Selective Service Bill of May of 1918, giving him the authority to do the draft, to do selective service. He got upwards of 500,000 men, basically, and he said there will be no volunteer units in the American Army. Because what Roosevelt was proposing was to pretty much strip all of the American supplies completely bare, and to take all the Americans' best officers, put them under his command, send them over to Europe, and that just would have been a big mess, because that just would have blown up in his face. And so he was strongly against what Roosevelt was doing, but he chose not to engage him directly. Once Roosevelt found out about it, he wrote a letter to him calling him insincere, calling him, and I went back to bashing him once again. And so that's what was going on with Theodore Roosevelt when President Wilson at the time, because they were really butting heads on what to do with the matter. So there you go.